All right. Hello and welcome. My name is Karavianka Funa, and I'm an enhanced leadership track intern. So I take great pleasure to acknowledge the company of our president, Mr. Aryan Salman. It gives immense joy to have you and our esteemed guests present today. And we would also like to acknowledge, on behalf of the Global Citizenship Foundation and the Council of Global Citizenship Education. Now, before I give the floor to our moderator today, please note that we will be sharing exclusive access to our global community. With this, you will be given the opportunity to connect with community builders and education leaders. So I'll have the link sent in the chat box. So just give me a moment, and this will be available for a few days for you to access and interact with everyone. All right. And also, do feel free to join the lounge and connect and network with all of the people that you meet here today. So, we hope you enjoy and welcome to the 19th OELF. It is my great pleasure to have the moderator to take the floor. All right. So, Esther, please take it from here.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining this event. I'm extremely excited to be here. We're so happy that you're joining us today to celebrate Pride Month and discuss keys to building gender-inclusive learning spaces. My name is Esther Brito. I am an education associate at the Global Center for LGBTI plus freedom and education, and I will be your moderator today. Before anything, I want to take the time to thank both the Global Citizenship Foundation for making this possible and our brilliant speakers for generously offering their time and expertise to help guide us through discussions regarding inclusive education. Thank you so much for joining us. As you know, this panel happens in the context of the 19th Online Educational Leadership Forum, which aims to provide a platform for school leaders to shape, empower, and influence, both influence and advance, discourse and action on transforming education for human flourishing. As such, in this event, we will hope to empower educators and educational leaders by deepening their understanding of gender inclusion, a vital area in education that can contribute to ensuring students' development into independent, thoughtful, and global citizens. There's a noted need for these kinds of conversations to happen, especially this year, in a context where we've seen the regression of civic rights around the world and the criminalization or reprimand of even talking about different gendered lived experiences and identities. As we look to mobilize and affect change as educators and activists, these spaces create the opportunity for cross-learning and partnerships that can help us advance towards the development of more gender-inclusive education and learning spaces. For our event today, we are lucky to have incredibly experienced and high-caliber speakers. It is my distinct pleasure to formally welcome all of our panelists and thank them for sharing their expertise with us. Before we proceed to our opening statements, I would really love to just offer you a short introduction of each of our panelists so we can get to know them a bit better and understand the amazing work they're doing. So our first panelist is Dr. S.J. Miller, a trans-plus-disciplinary award-winning teacher, writer, activist, and scholar. A professor in the Teacher Academy at the Santa Fe Community College and adjunct associate faculty in the program in educational leadership and learning in organizations at Vanderbilt University. Dr. Miller is a literacy expert specialist whose emphasis is on social justice and gender identity in pre-K through university level teaching. In this line, Dr. Miller has a PhD in educational thought and sociocultural studies from the University of New Mexico, having written over 30 book chapters, 50 articles, and 8 books. So absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Miller. It's lovely to be able to meet with you and learn from you during this event.
Thank you.
Well, I have more speakers to introduce. This is just the beginning of what will be a wonderful event. So I have the pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Alvin Dakis. Alvin is currently an independent and certified gender and development specialist who serves as a GAD consultant for various government agencies, as well as the managing director for the AD Gender PH Institute of Gender Equality. Alvin is also the science research specialist at the University of the Philippines Manila College of Medicine, whose current research interests and work span issues including gender studies, human security, sexual orientation, gender identity, LGBT health, sexual and reproductive health, HIV and AIDS care, and many other issues related to public health and policy. It is absolutely wonderful to meet you and to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Esther, and also Doc SJ. It's a pleasure to meet all of you here.
Thank you so much. Well, we are going to have, I believe, another speaker join us a little bit later, but I would like to also provide the intro for that speaker so you know a little bit about them when they join. So following this already wonderful set of speakers, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Chad Javert, the founder of Marginalized Majority, a nonprofit organization based in Toronto focused on emotional and social health of marginalized LGBTQ plus people and dedicated to highlighting the cultural experiences of queer immigrants and people of color. Dr. Javert is also a book author and a social inclusion and gender expert whose work focuses on the most vulnerable communities in the world by collaborating with government institutions, international funding agencies, and local implementing NGOs and CSOs. So the doctor will be joining us shortly. In the meantime, we will proceed to the next section, but thank you so much. We have absolutely wonderful speakers, and I'm so excited to learn from you. So now that we've had the chance to introduce everyone, it's time for me to stop talking and for us to proceed to hear them. The next section of our event will allow our speakers to provide their insights and comments, almost as a state of affairs review of gender inclusive education and learning. Well, I would like to offer the starting position. I don't know if Dr. Miller or Alvin, whoever would like to proceed.
Well, I think Doc Miller would be better to start off this event.
I was going to say the same thing to you.
Well, you're the first one to be introduced, so it would be better if you will be the first to speak.
Perfect. Dr. Miller, would you like to take the floor?
Sure. Again, I'm speaking from the context of the United States and where everyone is around the country and the world. Nice to meet you. Thank you for getting up, whether it's early or late in the middle of the day. So currently in the United States, as you probably have heard, we are under extreme duress. I've never seen things so volatile in the history of ground. I've been teaching math for close to 28 years, and we've seen much progress. We've seen lots of great work coming out of secondary education, out of university-based classrooms, out of policy changes. And I feel like over the past maybe 10 to 12 years, we've seen a strong momentum. And just this past year, after Donald Trump left office and Biden came in, we've seen this massive uptick of anger, of vitriol, of attempts to silence curriculum, silence children. And I'm going to get more to this when I talk a little bit later. But what we're seeing is this clamping down and this surveillance of teachers and bodies. In fact, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me. It's on my other slide. And I think over 23 states right now, it's going to become a criminal offense to be talking about LGBTQIA students or representations in history in a positive manner. And there are teachers who can be fired and in fact lose their teacher licenses in some of those states. And we're seeing in 3 states, it also becoming a possible felony conviction with up to 15 years life in prison. Again, these are unprecedented. It's of great concern. It doesn't mean that great work isn't happening in other states, and that's something I also want to celebrate. But at the same time, we are on high alert. And this is like every day. I mean, I was updating my slides last night. It's a constant tug of war between our political right and our political left. And at the bottom of all this are those children. Those are those 3 and 4 year olds that we're talking about. So I'll hand it over to Alvin.
Oh, all right. I'll be speaking in the context of the Philippine education, and so far right now we just elected the new vice president and the president of the Philippines. The incoming well the vice president of the Republic of the Philippines will also sit as the secretary or the minister of basic education in the Philippines. That's a huge responsibility, but at the same time we are actually very we are on our toes thinking and expecting what is she going to do with the current basic education in the Philippines and making it more inclusive for all learners, basic learners or basic education learners. In the higher education in the Philippines right now, we still don't have any person being appointed to sit in the Commission on Higher Education. However, if you look at the Philippine context in terms of um, the past efforts to make it more gender inclusive and responsive, there were actually efforts already. There were what they call this policies in place, such as there are policies on establishing guidelines on gender and development in the higher education institutions. There is actually a Department of Education memorandum that talks about the gender responsive basic education policy. And there are also other laws in the Philippines right now, such as the Anti-Bullying Act of 2013, wherein students should not be bullied based on their sexual orientation and gender identity, on their age and disability. However, some human rights groups, especially the Human Rights Watch, pointed out that despite of all this policy and measures that are already in place, the the education sector still is struggling in terms of becoming more inclusive. Teachers are still seen and reported to becoming part of the perpetrators of gender-based like sexual harassment, and perhaps saying those uh, jokes and statements on one's sexual orientation and gender identity. We can also see that there are some students are not allowed to graduate and march because of their gender expression. They were told to cut their hair. They're told to wear clothes that are appropriate to their biological sex, but these are actually transgender women, and they were not allowed to complete their graduation rites. However, again, with all of these things, there are still some ray of hope with the incoming Secretary of Education. We're now pushing that she be the champion of inclusive education in the Philippines. At the same time, we also see that the Philippines is also still is the top one country in Southeast Asia in terms of gender and development and gender mainstreaming in government institutions. But there are still challenges we need to deal with, especially for example the religious organizations that owns educational institutions, because many of these violations are actually happening in these private institutions and not in public institutions. So I think that would be the current situation of the Philippines in terms of gender inclusive education.
Thank you so much to both our speakers for these brilliant insights. One point that I'd like to bring into focus again, which both of you have mentioned very interestingly, is that there seems to be a tendency towards a coalescence of education and politics, specifically with related to gender inclusivity, which is manifesting here a little bit more positively in the Philippines and a little bit more complex in a complex manner within the context of the United States, specifically within the last year. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about your thoughts and perspectives as practitioners on whether this coalescence of sort of the politicization of education has become more noted in recent years, and what are some of the dynamics that might be worrying as related to that, or on the counterpoint, positive, when political figures decide that they will embrace and make inclusive education a cornerstone of their administration. So I wanted to get thoughts from both of you in sort of this developing issue that we're seeing affect education.
I'd like to hear first from SJ, because many of the things that were done in the United States were actually being replicated in the Philippines in terms of inclusive education, to be honest. And that's why I'd like to hear first of what's happening there. Because I am not too updated already of what's happening in terms of the politics and the coalescence in terms of education sector. And perhaps maybe I can mirror that in terms of what's happening in the Philippines.
Sure. And Alvin, it's really interesting to see how closely connected we are with in relationship to the attitudes, the current attitudes, right, and the types of curriculum and policies that are coming down. Right now, again, I think states are more split than ever. We've just had some very, very scary Supreme Court rulings, undoing reproductive rights, undoing possibly civil rights, dismantling parts of religious freedom. And so what's happening then is in states, these splinters, again, these are just happening. I mean, just this past week. And so a lot of power has been kicked back to states' rights. We have no federal guidance right now around protections for LGBTQIA people. And putting it back in states' hands creates these polarizing viewpoints. We have the left and the right, and we have the conservative movement. And so it's really up to individual school districts, individual cities, and local ordinances even to set up some of these different these viewpoints. But at the state level, we also have a patchwork of non-discrimination policies. So from those states' perspectives, some kids are protected and some aren't. And I was just looking at a map, and again, it's horrendous how few kids are actually protected from the state level. It doesn't mean, again, they can't be from the city and the local levels. But in terms of like holistic curriculum that's being handed down from the top of states, those are only in a few states. And so, I mean, it's so important in the United States more than ever to vote. I mean, I've never seen, again, things so polarized. And I was talking to a friend the other day, and we're like, well, what can we do if our LGBTQIA kids don't have those state protections and the federal protections? And it's like, you have to start having conversations with kids at 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, so they understand and recognize the importance of voting from an early age, because I mean, they're our future. They're our hope. And if we continue in the manner that we're going to go, I worry that even the little progress that we have is going to go away. And I'm a hopeful person. I mean, this is my life work, but I am very, very concerned about the direction that our country is heading in.
Yeah, we are concerned as well, because as I said, as what is happening in the United States actually affect the Philippine education system, because many of the things that were done in the Philippines were actually like a reflection of the educational system in the United States. An example of that would be the comprehensive sexuality education. That component actually, when I was still actively lobbying as part of the team that pushed for the reproductive health and responsible parenthood bill that eventually that turned into law. I was part of the implementing rules and regulations team, and we were working with many of the members of the Senate and in Congress. And this is where what you have just observed, Esther, that politics and education is actually coalescing, and that there are many of these aspects that I have not even like imagined that will even happen. Like for example, there was this one. I do remember very vividly. There's this one event or during one Senate panel session. I was a member of the panel session, One of the senators was actually saying that we should not teach children how to have sex, because sexuality education is, teaching children how to have sex. Like, no, that's not what it is. And we've been telling them over and over again what are the components of sexuality education. It's actually to protect themselves from, being harassed, and also to, to be able to, protect their own bodies, and report if there are any incidences of that violation. And these senators will not just listen, and they will continue on ranting for longer periods of time until the time is already consumed for the debates, and it will lengthen the entire discussion of how comprehensive sexuality education should be integrated in the Philippine education curriculum or curricula. So that's one way that they did. They railroaded that. Another one is, of course, not just the legislators, but also the Supreme Court. We were facing a legal battle in the Supreme Court during that time, because many of the Supreme Court justices, that was around 2016 or 2018, and many of them are highly religious people, and that actually affected the way that they interpreted the comprehensive sexuality education. So we are actually on the verge of what are we going to do with them. We don't even know how to communicate with them, because they will not allow us. We are just there outside of the halls waiting for their verdict. uh, but fortunately, they sided with science, and they allowed the comprehensive sexuality education to go through without any changes at all in the law. However, when it comes to the Department of Education, the Commission on Higher Education, and all of those executive offices that are actually managing and implementing the education system in the Philippines, that's another battle, because there are a lot of politics there. For example, I do remember the Secretary of Education was a literal, religious brother. So how are we going to like explain to brother, then brother, how are we going to explain to him that the importance of sexuality education to kids, to teenagers, adolescents? And well, he said, as long as I am the Secretary of Education, there will be no comprehensive sexuality education that will be implemented during my term, and that's for the next 6 years. So a lot of these opportunities, and a lot of kids are actually exposed to violence. They're exposed to harassment, and even though we have policies in place, there is no safety net for them. um, and what else? Currently, there are also teachers with their politics that they bring into the table, because this is not just talking about politics of those who are in the halls of power. We're also talking about the educators who have political beliefs, spiritual and religious beliefs that will affect the way that they are going to teach, implement the curriculum, their unconscious biases, in the classroom. Many of the LGBTQIA students are actually being harassed. They feel they're excluded, because the teachers themselves are the ones who said that the Bible only created men and women. You are not one of them. So when we're talking about the politics, it's not just the people there in making those policies, or writing this legislation, but also those who are in the ground. That's very critical for us to address as well.
Thank you so much for those brilliant interventions. I find it extremely interesting because ultimately both your interventions have talked about the issue of ideological entrenchment and how that serves as a devising force or a stopping force to advancing gender inclusive learning spaces. So in the US, polarized by party and almost mobilized by parties in order to attract or mobilize their voters. And in the Philippines, by limiting implementation or potential implementation of even progressive policies in this regard. So it's interesting because here in Europe, there's an incredible divisiveness between states and even within different communities of what gender inclusive education means, whether it's positive or negative, and whether there should be any modifications made towards it. And we have, the vast differences between some areas like Spain that are, although I would say gender inclusive education in Spain is still at a very much the beginning stages, and again, very dispar. There's been a movement of policies towards gender affirming care. There's been a movement of policies towards facilitating the recognition of gender identity and minimizing the possibilities of abuse. Please forgive me if you hear a background noise, but hopefully it's not too bad. But there has been some progressive policies versus what you are seeing as a sort of a reaction or a pushback from some states like Hungary or Poland, with almost these LGBT free zones, which is conceptually incredible. So we see these breaking points within communities and political polarization in terms of ideological polarization in terms of implementation that are really fracturing any kind of substantive or homogeneous, I don't know if it's the right word, progress towards gender inclusive education. So thank you so much for those insights. I think this is incredibly interesting, and having these kinds of regional or state comparisons is also interesting to understand what's being done. And I also, so please forgive me for this background noise. Hopefully you can't hear it too much, but
It's okay.
someone is constructing things when they should not. Thank you again for your brilliant interventions. It's super exciting to listen to you to give insight on these areas of education. And I want to proceed to the next subsection of the event, which allows each of you to ask the other or me questions that you might think are relevant or that you might want answers on regarding issues of LGBTI inclusion and education, broader sort of societal realities in different spaces. So I would just like to open the floor for any of our speakers to ask questions and for us to have a little bit of a continued conversation for a few minutes on that. Dr. Miller, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I'm trying to process some of the things that Alvin said. So Alvin, I have a question about how students are taught around their bodies in schools. You talked a little bit about sex inclusive language, learning about that. In the United States, we don't have that. It's optional. People are very adamant about sexuality in certain houses. It's relegated to the states again. So we have what's called state standards. We have what's called the Common Core standards. And these are the different standards that teachers are expected to teach to, unfortunately. And so if it is not written into the state standards, teachers cannot or should not talk about those issues. It doesn't mean that they're not. But those teachers are also at risk in some states for losing their job. So we don't have comprehensive sex education in schools. And you talked a little bit about your system. If you could share more about that, I'm really interested in learning.
Yeah. For the comprehensive sexuality education, what I've heard so far is that the last discussion that we had with the Department of Education and the Commission on Higher Education is that there's going to be a set of standards that is going to be like similar to as what you have just said, like a similar set of standards that will be implemented in from college to high school or like junior high school and until the elementary or the basic education. However, that standard is still not present so far. But I do know that the basic education, for example, there are actually courses on sexuality that I can see already because many of this of the learning interventions that were done by the Department of Education currently is already made into online because of the pandemic, and therefore you can actually see them in YouTube talking about sexuality, talking about your own body, how to protect yourself, what is sex and what is gender. So I do see that. I can see some teachers doing that already. In the higher education for college, for example, there is actually a basic education course on gender and society, which I used to teach. And that is actually a very comprehensive course wherein you can talk about sexuality. We can talk about gender and development, women empowerment. We can talk about LGBTQIA. However, in my experience, when I was teaching then, it was not standardized. There is no standard component of this course. The teachers or the professors, for that matter, they will be the one to choose what topics are we going to include in this course, which means that one of the things that I saw was they let the universities, choose which topics will be included in this course. For the basic education, there is already a standard like method of how you teach it, because there is already a policy that I mentioned already earlier, and that is the gender responsive basic education policy. And in the basic education policy, to make it more gender sensitive and inclusive, they are actually ensuring that gender and development is actually mainstreamed or integrated in the learner's development. It is also included in the curriculum standards. So they do have some set of standards in terms of how to teach it, in terms of younger learners going to higher learners. And then learning delivery, there's also a set of different styles of which they can actually use. And there is also a part of the policy is creating a learning environment. So part of the policy is to ensure that the environment becomes safe for people and students and teachers to actually talk about sexuality and gender and sex without the fear of retaliation and harassment. Also, there are learning resources that are available made by the Department of Education. However, I think we still need to make sure that all of these learning education resources are comprehensive in such a way that it is not just talking about like heteronormative, sex and gender, because currently that's the go-to of a lot of the educators, which means that most often we would forget about the intersectionality of gender in terms of how it is affecting disability, how it is affecting sexuality, how it is affecting cultural dimensions. Because the Philippines still has learners who are belonging in the indigenous communities. So these are the things that we need to, I think, review and check. Another one that I'd like to point out is in terms of the delivery of these learning materials, because the learning materials are actually good. I mean, we started; it's not yet perfect, but there's something that we can work on. However, in terms of the delivery, that's where I'm really conscious about, because as you have said, SJ, like there are many educators in United States and similarly in the Philippines who are very adamant of discussing about sexuality out in the open, because these individuals, these teachers back in the days when they were students, when they were young, it was not part of the discussion. It was not, part of the community wherein we talk about sexuality that openly. And then here we are, in a generation wherein we're focused in our TikToks, we're focused on our social media, and a lot of these students are actually consuming this information vastly from the internet, and they are now asking the teachers, what is happening, what is this, what is that, and then they are like caught in the in the crossfire of this exchange of rapid exchange of information, and they were like, oh no, what do I do? I don't know how to deliver this. I don't even know how to say this. I can't even say the word penis or vagina. I can't say those words because I think I will like disappear and go to heaven or wherever. So these are the things that, funny as it may seem, but this is the current reality of many of the educators. So I do remember that many of the educators that I have talked to and trained, they said that whenever they feel uncomfortable discussing the topic, they would usually refer the student to an individual who is actually knowledgeable on the topic, there would be someone, for example, in the university or in the school who's more open about their sexuality. So what they do is actually they would say, you can talk to this teacher, you can talk to this individual because I think they can, explain well because I think I can. And that's a good, that's a good behavior to start off, instead of telling students as if they know everything, but actually, they don't. So I think those are the things we are experiencing right now in the Philippines in terms of how, educators or teachers are teaching sexuality education in the country. All right, you're on mute. Okay.
I, oh, Dr. Miller, would you like to go first?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really quite struck by what you said. I mean, students kind of like they're so excited to talk about sex, sexuality, and sexual orientation, except teachers are scared to talk about it, right? So
Yeah.
it's classrooms are very fear based, and like you said, it's from a very heteronormative lens, and the minute that students try to push teachers, I've noticed there is very little discussion around trans, non-binary,
Oh yeah.
queer sex, and why is it that we can continue to reinforce cis privilege, right? Cis normativity, cis sexualism.
Mm,
Because when we do that, right, we're ignoring a whole other population of students. And also, we are diminishing the capacity for students that are heteronormative to learn about different lifestyles,
that's right.
right? We continue to privilege some lifestyles over the other. And when
Yeah.
we do that in school, we know that, I mean, most of kids spend, I don't know how many hours it is a week, but over the course of their life, those formative years, they're developing these types of mindsets and beliefs about students that are different from them. And so I think this contributes to these rationales around toxic masculinity, right?
Hmm.
Um, or a depreciation of the female body. And,
Yeah.
and so what students are doing, like you said, they're going on internet, they're going to TikTok, they're going on Tumblr, they're going Instagram.
Yeah.
I traced a group of students many years and to look at the different ways that they were identifying and having like emotional relationships. I mean, I have this compilation of like over 400 terms. Like
Mm,
they are developing literacy in their own bodies, right? And yet none of that is being apprenticed into the school system. So then you have these students without like human dexterity where they're learning something here in what I call micro sanctuaries, but then they're not learning it in school. And then,
right.
so how safe is what you're learning outside of school? Well, for these students, for the most part, for them it feels safe, but for some it doesn't, and so they turn to sex work.
Correct.
Especially if you are a non-binary person of color, and you don't understand how world the world works, then sometimes you end up going into really dangerous situations. And the school system is, I feel, is creating that. It's
That's
the
right.
larger politics creating those types of human disparities. We have a very large homeless population in the United States of queer youth because of a lack of understanding in schools and in families. Again, so much of this comes down to religion, though. It comes down to religion and the way that some espouse hate
Yeah,
for those who stand outside of the binary.
that's true. Um, I'm actually like trying to recall some of my experiences with when I was teaching gender and society in one of the universities, and I do remember that, as you've said about the micro sanctuary, it was my classroom was the micro sanctuary. So because many of the teachers were saying that you can't have tattoos, that's bad. I mean, that's the symbol of the devil, and they try to cover it up because it's part of their gender expression. And whenever they're in my classroom, they can actually express themselves openly. I allow them to not even sit in chairs and sit wherever you want to sit, and express the way you want to express. And then I do remind them though that there is a larger system in place that actually is very limited. It's very constrictive, and it actually, we have to remind ourselves that whenever we go out of this classroom, we are still subjected to that rules, to those rules, that you have to wear this uniform, you have to look this and that, and I do empathize with students like that, but as one teacher or one educator is actually open, it doesn't mean that we can change the entire policy or landscape of that educational institution, but we can at least create an environment wherein they will feel safe and they can actually explore without feeling judged. And one of the things that I actually notice is that, um, some of the teachers there in that university would refer their students to me whenever they have some issues or problems or concerns about their sexuality, about what they're going through. It's because these teachers, they know that they cannot handle that, because they're not as well educated as well. um, However, there are also educators out there that will create a learning space that is very constricting, limiting, reinforcing these stereotypes and biases. And for them, that's power. I mean, they want that. I mean, they want to do that because for them, they see that these students are actually following me and being obedient to me. But apparently, we're making, the future generation that's resentful of the current, system. And at the same time, we're losing them. We're losing grip of this educator. I mean, these students, and they go elsewhere. They find resources elsewhere that we are not even sure if these resources are correct. They are scientific. They are actually, um, what do you call this, made by, like us, who have been studying about this, and we don't know what are those things that they're learning from their friends, from other people, and that makes me worry about a lot of those situations. I don't know how we're going to address them, but perhaps one step at a time. Maybe we can in one of these days. I'd just like to ask Dr. Miller, because there are actually a lot of talks right now in terms of how the Supreme Court made their decision regarding abortion rights, like in the U.S., and that is actually a huge impact to education on abortion in the Philippines as well. Uh, how do you think will that decision affect the comprehensive sexuality education efforts of different countries in the and and how will that become a precedent situation for, let's say, the Philippines, wherein we actually look up to the American education standards?
Don't copy us. don't, don't copy. I don't want anybody copying us. I'm thinking about moving to outer space right now. You know, going to Mars. um, so I think the danger of these policies are what are called loopholes. And what I've learned recently is that unless a word is actually written or codified into the Constitution, it allows for these loopholes to happen. So, for instance, with the Supreme Court ruling recently, against Roe v. Wade, abortion was never written into the Constitution. What was written into the Constitution is that women are allowed to make decisions that are for the welfare, the benefit, and the welfare of their family. And
Mm,
say abortion.
right, that's right.
And so what you have is when you have words not actually, then what you have these within different titles and articles, it allows for that level of decision making that then can impact a large population of people. And so the same with like anti-bullying laws.
Mm,
Words matter. Like if things are not enumerated, literally broken down, you can't just say we don't discriminate against students. It has to say we don't discriminate against, lesbian, gay, bisexual, brown, black, children, because if it's just that blanketed, it lends itself for people to come in and disrupt that.
Right.
And so when you talk about, us being a mirror, well, we know that discussions around bodies are going to become more and more censored than they have been in those states where abortion becomes legalized. And many of us are already fearful of people leaving states to go get abortions in other states, but then some states having trigger laws. And with those trigger laws, what can happen is that basically the average citizen could find out who's going to another state and basically become bounty hunters and receive money and receive praise for identifying people that are leaving those states. And if you're caught, you could face prison time or a fine. So I'm very, very concerned about the direction that we're heading in. We have states, again, that are that support women's right to abortion, that are pro-choice. And so what we're going to have, too, is, again, even a larger spread around where we believe that women should have rights to their. And we're concerned, again, that women, though, even though this ruling has come down, that women are forced back into becoming second-class citizens ideologically, right? So even though, like New Mexico, you can go get an abortion, it's still, because of the Supreme Court ruling, that you have limited decisions about your body from the federal level. And that's a very scary place to be in. And so young girls, right, or even young couples, we can't forget about the boys.
Yeah.
Because many of these boys are in partnership, right? And when they're intentionally conceiving, they are going to suffer too. And we can't forget the impact that this is going to have on our male population. So sex ed, is more important than ever, but it's going to be more censored than it has ever been.
Right.
Thank you both for these brilliant questions. And just to your point, Dr. Miller, I remember this almost bounty hunting law that I believe originated in Texas that allowed people to sue for, I believe it was around $10,000 to anyone that had either gotten an abortion or aided in any way to receiving that kind of care. So the way that these laws are setting precedents for almost a prosecution status, not only a passive prosecution status by limiting accessibility or like completely outlawing, but almost an active prosecution across that it's obviously going to affect, as we've talked about, intersectionality, those that already suffer from intersecting vulnerabilities, and it's going to be very targeted. And there's been a lot of conversations that I've been following in the US about within the feminist movement, how this will not affect white women the same way it will affect women of color. It will not affect rich women the same way it will affect those that have less socioeconomic resources, and how that codifies another set of power structures and again, limited bodily autonomy, which will have implications for other groups. There's been discussions about how the derogation of Roe v. Wade will further affect the LGBT community, how it will affect policing of bodies, and these kinds of issues that are dangerous precedents, especially because of this issue we've been talking about of US policy being replicated across other states, and how we've seen that over the last few years. So this becomes something, as you were saying, preoccupying, and that we have to mobilize to address, and extremely interesting to discuss. I don't know if you have any further points on this, but if not, I would proceed to the next section, because we're going to have some questions from me, which hopefully are interesting, and then we're going to open the floor to questions from our audience. There's already a few of them in the chat, so I'd really like to be able to hopefully address that a little bit. But yes, so there's a section now where I, the moderator, get to ask you questions that just to me are incredibly interesting, and I hope to our audience will be as well. And one of the ones that I found that there's little guidance on, and you as practitioners can have a very specific insight on, is what the core elements that define a gender inclusive curriculum are. How would you approach that, define that, and I would really love to get your thoughts on that. Alvin, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, I'm more of a adult learning practitioner, so I'm more focused on training the teachers actually rather than teaching the students, because I see that as one of the gaps in the Philippine gender inclusive learning practice, because if you want to make sure that uh, teachers and educators are actually sensitive, the curriculum is inclusive, we need the teachers and educators to be sensitive themselves. And that's where I come in, because I have been a consultant of state universities and colleges here in in the country, and one of the things that I saw was a lot of the teachers actually were operating from their unconscious biases in terms of the bias as, to a certain sex, certain gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity. And because of these biases that they have, that they are not aware, these actually manifest in into words, behaviors, gestures, even the tone of voice whenever they're talking about sex or mentioning that word. So it becomes, it becomes politically charged, it becomes, filled with a lot of animosity, or perhaps they're now instead of more open, they become very constrained in terms of discussing these things, and they protect that because they it is so ingrained in this country right now that our ideas about sexuality is so ingrained with our personal values and religiosity, religious practice, and it's just so very difficult to for us to navigate that without touching their sensitivities. So one of the things that I saw was breaking down that unconscious bias first in our educators. And the second one, perhaps to making a gender sensitive and inclusive learning spaces, perhaps materials, is to ensure that policies are there that are very clear in terms of telling the implementers of how to make sure that gender sensitivity and responsiveness is actually embedded into the curriculum, embedded in learning materials. However, apart from those policies is the implementation of those policies, because I've seen that there have been good policies in place. I've mentioned some of them already, like the anti-bullying law. I mentioned also the department memorandum of the of, Department of Education on gender inclusive and sensitive education policy, but these are good in paper. I mean, it's not, it's not implemented and monitored closely. And what happens is that, there are a lot of loopholes in terms of how you go through this, because there is no office to that monitors them. There's no continuity of those educators who have been trained, and when they were trained, they were just like oriented about, okay, so what is SOG, what is sexual orientation and gender identity, what is the meaning of the LGBTQIA, and that's it. But in terms of transforming those knowledge into the actual practice, how are you going to teach it, how are you going to respond to questions, how are you going to phrase it, like there was this one debate before about, again, going back to comprehensive sexuality education. How are you going to teach comprehensive sexuality education in math, in science, and in English perhaps? And they were like just looking at me like blank. Like, okay, they don't even know how to do that. Again, the policy is in place, but we need to ensure that it's being implemented and monitored as well. Another one that I saw was there seems to be a disconnect between the the advocates and the educators. So like the advocates, like they're they are there in the streets. They were actually protesting. They're doing a lot of advocacy materials and advocacy activities, but it doesn't seem to penetrate, or to be part of the system, the education system. uh, that's one of the things that I actually like very interested. How are we going to make sure that all of these messages about advocating about our bodies, advocating about healthy relationships, stigma and discrimination, how is it going to translate into the actual learning materials, transforming the educators, or dismantling the patriarchal structures in universities, colleges, and even the smaller schools. And that those are the things that I saw are the gaps and the challenges right now. And I think I'll let SJ like continue on whatever that I forgot.
First of all, Esther, thank you for all your provocative questions. If I were more alert, I'd probably be more clear-headed. But when you talk about, you asked us about what is a gender inclusive curriculum to us. And I want to challenge the word gender because we're presuming that people live in some type of a binary. And
Yes.
I would rather use the word, what is a human or a humanist centered curriculum. Um, but then I was thinking humanist also presumes that our students are human. Like I have students I've worked with who identify as emojis or xylophones, and that's about self-determination, and we might laugh, but then because that's new, right? That
Yeah.
might trigger a moment of discomfort because this is ultimately about how we start to see other people. And what we know we want is that our students have a right to exist. So they should never challenged on their right to exist exactly as they are. So what we're talking about is I don't like to use the word mental health. You hear that word a lot, but mental wellness, that we
Mhm.
all need to have mental wellness, and we all need to feel like we're understood and that we're heard. So a humanist-based curriculum would be, introducing texts pre-K that start to broaden that perspective. Now, children understand bullying, and so bullying, for whatever reason, is just kind of instilled in their being before they even come to school. And using texts that demonstrate bullying, I think, helps for them to understand um, how people end up being oppositional to each other. But you don't often see picture books with people, you see animals, because kids can relate to stuffed animals, in a way that they can't quite yet relate to humans, because young children project that onto animals, and there's a power dynamic. They can control animals. So it's a really interesting process that you see kids in early K go through. But a inclusive curriculum would have this type of self-determination followed through pre-K through 12th. And that would be embedded in math, science, English, social studies, art, humanities, physical education. Because a lot of the teachers often think, well, a humanist-centered curriculum is just based in the English classroom because literature lends itself to that. But again, with students that I've worked with teachers, pre-service teachers that I've worked with, it's really about how do you look at science, math, social studies? Like, are you talking about different histories of people, different genetic histories, right? Different chromosomal histories, or writing word problems in math that, are more open around different types of people, right? That it's not just Matthew and Sally go to blah, 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 but it could be John and John, right? Or
Mhm.
John and Trey, or John, Trey, and John. Like it could be polyamory, right?
Mhm.
Polygamous, not polygamous, but open relationships. Again, to that we're proselytizing and trying to recruit kids into a particular lifestyle, you know. But we need to have a trans and non-binary history in history classes. In physical education, we need to have equality, right? We need to not segregate our boys and our girls, or say that trans kids or trans girls can't play on certain boys teams and trans girls can't play on certain girls teams. That's a huge issue in the United States right now with transgender athletic bans. And that, unfortunately, is going to become even more vast and widespread than it has in the past, you know. But the other part of it is educating administrators. I think the teachers that we're seeing in the K-12 schools, they're scared to take up the work because they don't know how to.
That's right.
The ones that are really well-meaning and intentioned, they just don't know how to. And this falls back on pre-service teacher education. That's been my field for the past 19 years. I feel very comfortable having those conversations with my pre-service teachers because that's been the work. But I know colleagues who won't touch it, and they'll say, "Well, go to SJ for that." Whereas everybody needs to learn about how to do this humanist inclusive education.
Yeah.
Do you want to say something, Alvin?
I just like to corroborate and follow through as well as you said that the pre-service, the training for educators as well in the Philippines is something that we also need to focus on because as well as you said, there are well-meaning educators. They are very open to it, but they're just afraid to tackle the subject because they don't know how to navigate it. They don't know how to respond to it properly in such a way that it will not trigger any negative reaction, or perhaps being asked of questions that they are not aware of. Like for example, if a teacher was a demisexual, like, oh, okay, I haven't heard that word in my entire life. And how am I going to explain that to the
Right.
child? So it's something that I think that we also need to focus is the pre-service training for the teachers, breaking down those barriers, and at the same time making them more open about their own sexuality, because I said that as well when I was teaching some of the faculty members in one of the university. I told them that if you're not comfortable with your own sexuality, if you're not comfortable with your own self, it is very difficult for you to teach this subject, or
Right.
this course, or this to know even talk about the topic. It's because there are a lot of things in your head going on, and you're battling your own demons, your realities. You're battling your a lot of these confusing things, and then here you are trying to appear in front of the class as if like you know everything already about the topic. So those are the things that I told them to go and reassess yourselves first. Also try to uncover your unconscious biases, work with those biases at the same time. Trying to learn more things, and there are actually, I told some of the educators that you will learn more from these kids, you will learn more from them, because they are they are so confident of their own sexuality, they're confident about their own gender identities, their sexual orientation, that they can actually give you insights, they can give you a lot of this information. One of the things that I encounter is that with a lot of educators that I've met, whenever they're phrasing their students, it is as if they should be the ones in authority of knowledge. But one of the things I've learned in adult learning is that that's the other way around. Make the environment a learning environment, not just for the students, but also to you, and and open yourself to them. I'm interested to learn about your lives, and how you see yourselves, and the things that you've been hearing, and all the things that you're learning, and we'll learn together from that, from that process. And a lot of the students that I was able to work with would feel less tension. They would feel the bond. They would actually see me more as a human being rather than someone in the pedestal is all knowing and doing all these things, teaching them what to do and where to go. And I feel more connected to them. And because of that, there are also a lot of these things that I encountered, that there are other factors that are actually affecting these students in terms of how they consume knowledge and information, and even existing in universities or in schools. For example, their family members, their friends. If teachers are very open about sexuality, but their parents are not, it's going to be a little bit problematic, because when they go back to their homes, they are now in an environment where in their parents are saying this is not how to do it. This is what our religious teachings are telling us to do, and that puts the student in a very difficult situation, because in school it's being discussed, but in my home it's closed. I mean, everything is the opposite. So it we might lose our students because of that. And of course with their friends, whenever they're with their friends, also with LGBT students that I have worked with, uh, they feel that they are actually there but they're not, so they feel like they're detached because they cannot find themselves as part of the group. I mean, they're there but they can't relate to whatever the other students are actually talking about. When I was a student myself, I felt that way because I am a bisexual, and I learned that very late in my life. I whenever I'm with my gay friends, they will always tell me you're a lesbian because you like girls. And whenever I'm with my straight friends or heterosexual friends, they will tell me you're gay because you like men. And like, okay, where am I going to place myself in this situation? And I grew up without anybody to turn to and to talk about what my feelings are until I became a nurse myself. And that was the only time I came into realization that okay, so I'm comfortable with myself. I already knew about myself, but it really took me a long time. I'm already out of school. I'm already teaching during that time. And then that's what I realized, that my experiences can also affect other students later on. Whenever I tell them my life story, they now become more open about it. So it's not just the teachers or the education system, but also the parents, the friends that they have, and also their social lives. It has a lot of impact. So those are the things I'd like to point out.
Thank you. Thank you. I've loved the responses to these questions so much. I love that notion of allowing for learning from teachers and students, and that self-assessment from educators as well. And to SG's point, I love that questioning the categories, the words we use, and whether they're effective or whether they're reinforcing some binaries that aren't useful and aren't inclusive and are sort of almost perpetuating some of the problems we're trying to address. So in opening, I think a lot of that has to do with that tolerance for change, that tolerance for not knowing, and allowing yourself to ask questions and to question, critique, and interrogate some of the concepts that even you think you're familiar with or you're comfortable with. That doesn't mean they're most effective. That doesn't mean that they can't be bettered or they can't be expanded. And ultimately, all of this are categorizations that we use to position and understand ourselves in society, and they have to be dynamic and they have to be changing, and we have to learn from each other, from our students, from the way language and even our perceptions of self-identity evolve. And I would like to ask you both 20 more questions, but that would take all the time, and I had so many questions here, you have no idea. But I have to give it to our audience because I don't want to take all the time. We do have some questions in the Q&A section. You'll see the ones that appear on the top have been upvoted, and they might be, oh, actually they're appearing in the screen. That is perfect. So the first question we see has to do with what it states is: many educators I meet are caring and concerned about the well-being of learners, even in countries that are hostile to discussions on gender. How can educators navigate through this crucial yet controversy, steering and polarizing domain in education? Alvin, SJ, would you like to offer your thoughts?
Hmm.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I think one of the most important things that teachers can do is find and create what I call figured worlds, which comes from Dorothy Holland's work. And figured worlds, are people coming together around similar ideas, similar passions, similar concerns. So whether it's having, a book group, watching movies, inviting in speakers more knowledgeable around topics, but surrounding yourself with more knowledgeable others is really important. And then also that can help bolster a level of confidence. Unfortunately, that doesn't necessarily mean that the administrators are going to be supportive, which is another problem, is that, their teacher surveillance goes around. But whatever they can do to offer a classroom that fosters safety, that seeks to affirm kids in a positive way, and to recognize human difference in whatever way that means. These are tenets that need to be part of the curricular process. And I agree with Alvin. It's going back and checking your unconscious bias. It's learning about microaggressions and the nuances of what we share. I mean, one of the things that I say, that I like to say, is that how do we know what we don't even know we should know? Because
Yeah.
teachers aren't necessarily even aware that they're microaggressing and they're shutting down kids. So really involving yourself in the community, living as an ally, not being an ally, but living as an ally, which might mean, defunding or not participating in certain organizations that don't support LGBTQIA causes. There's a lot of education that can come from just being out and being aware in public, learning how to march, how to protest, how to lobby. There's so many different ways that teachers can learn how to navigate those systems, but you have to find somebody. You have to find someone to reach out to, whether it's in person or on the internet.
That's a brilliant point of intervention. Just one small note: there's been a massive influx of literature and resources to do specifically with anti-racism that have followed through the last few years that have a lot of these kinds of uh, learning or messages to do with questioning, to do with active allyship, which is a great resource as well, especially when we're talking about intersectionality with regards to sexuality, race, and the different ways we conceptualize ourselves. And I'll stop talking. Alvin, is there something you'd like to add?
Uh, yeah. There are a lot of creative ways to actually, navigate with through this very, let's say, controversial topic. One of the things that I did was to make it less controversial by actually, relating it to life experiences that are actually more like, that people can relate to. Like for example, when I talk about unconscious biases, I would ask the students or the learners to actually grab a piece of paper of different colors and write a draw a basic shape in the middle of that paper, and I want you to stand up and just look around and group together. And now they will group together for whatever that they want or however they want to. And then later on I will ask them, what were the decision making process or processes that you did in grouping together. And then one of the group of students actually said we grouped together based on the shape that we drew in our paper. And then when I told them that you could have you group yourselves based on the color of the paper or how it's being folded or the thickness of the pen that you used, but they didn't do that. It's because we operate on a certain bias, and the bias is the drawing in the middle of the paper. We have never thought of colors. We have not used other dimensions, and that's the unconscious biases that we have. So whenever I do that, the learners actually will think, okay, so yeah, I've not thought of those things. There are different ways that we can be more creative in discussing. One of the things, for example, is that when I train teachers or educators, especially those that are going to handle younger students, whenever I ask them to mention the word penis or vagina, I would have to ask them to repeat the word 10 times. And yeah, they have to yeah, they will laugh at first, and then at around 7, 8, or around 10, in the 10th time they're not laughing anymore, because that's part of what we call sensitization. You need to be, you're going to be more sensitized whenever you keep hearing the word over and over again. And we our what our biases about the word, our the fears of talking about that word will now be diminished because we have been using it over and over again, and it's now less controversial for you, and then you can be more confident about talking about it without feeling guilt or anything at all. So there are actually creative ways for us to do this. But we also have to be a little bit more careful in terms of there are certain countries wherein these words can't be said. We can try to navigate that by more creative means, like through art, through songs. One of the things that I did before was to, as for them to analyze a song, pick a song of their choice, and analyze the lyrics of the song. And the song was actually about sex. So they were now talking about it. Oh, okay. I never thought about this song of an artist is talking about sex. Yes, but the words that they used were something else. It's like a reference to that, and that's one of the things that we can do, becoming more creative.
That is absolutely brilliant. As always, thank you so much for your responses. This is incredibly interesting. We have to wrap up because we are already at time. I think that, we were going to talk about recommendations, but I feel like that's embedded in a lot of the answers and the discussions we've been having that have flown quite naturally. So with that, I just, as a closing statement, I want to thank our speakers for this incredibly engaging conversation. I wish I could ask you so many more questions, and thank our hosts for allowing us to have these conversations. We have attendees from all over the world, and I hope that this has been an engaging experience for them as well. So thank you so much for having us.
All right, and thank you so much for being here. So before we wrap things up, I would like to take the opportunity for a little photo. So just give me a moment. Hopefully everyone has their smiles and energy for that. So just 1, 2, 3. Okay. And just one more for good luck.
All right.
Okay. All right. 1, 2, 3. Okay. And thank you so much for that. So also for everyone around here, kindly join our community platform. The link is pinned up here. And also take advantage of the lounge while we have a 15-minute break before Dr. SJ's session. So very excited to see what's in store for that. So thank you, everyone. So have your breakfast, lunch, or dinners.
Thank you, everyone. And I'm so honored to be with you today. Thank you also, Esther, for a wonderful job in moderating this event. And also to SJ, a lot of your inputs are so refreshing to me. Kara, thank you very much. Everyone, take care.
All right. Thank you.
Take care, everyone. It has been lovely to speak with you. And best luck, SJ, with your following session.
Yeah, let me grab some coffee. Esther?
Uh-huh.
I need to run to the bathroom, and then can you help me real quick with the slides?
I will be here, of course, 100%.